Russia and Ukraine. According to the Daily Mail, it says that Russia suffers deadliest day in Ukraine war as 1,090 men lose their lives. And the Daily Mail says Putin's bloodlust takes horrendous toll on his own forces with bitter battle of Bakhmut raging. What is the latest on the ground in Ukraine and how does it apply to us?
Well, all those headlines are lies, Charlie. The Russians haven't taken those heavy casualties at all. In fact, we think that the Russians have had since the beginning of the war somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 dead. The exchange rate over the last few weeks has been about 1 Russian for every 5 Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have been bled white, and they're getting ready for reasons that make absolutely no military sense to commit more forces to Bakhmut, which has turned into an enormous ambush, if you will, for the Ukrainians. The Russians are happy for thousands of Ukrainians to pile in there so that they can be concentrated and become easy targets for artillery, rockets, missiles, drones, and so forth. There's very little direct fire between the two sides in the area because the Ukrainians have simply made themselves lucrative targets. And they've taken tremendous casualties. We think that they're up to 200,000 dead at this point. So you've just got to take anything that comes out of the Western media and quite frankly dismiss it. They're all lies trying to bolster the Ukrainian cause because Ukraine is on its last legs. Now you have the muddy season. And the muddy season followed a very, very short winter. The Russians opted not to attack in the winter because they just didn't get the hard freeze all over Ukraine that they need for hundreds of thousands of troops to advance. So they've decided to sit back and the Ukrainians continue to come to them, which makes it easy for them to kill the Ukrainians. Ukrainians have become pop-up targets. And at the same time, you've got this terrible mud. And the black earth in Ukraine is 10 to 15 feet deep.
Wow.
So you're talking about a mud pit in which tanks and trucks and anything, frankly, on the ground that moves will just sink to the bottom. So there's nothing going to happen in terms of major offensive operations from the Russian side until the mud dries out. That'll take another month or two.
So I conveyed a similar opinion to what you just said to a neoliberal, neoconservative recently. And he asked me this question, and I didn't have a great response. He said, well, then how come there has not been more territorial gains by the Russians if the Russians are dominating? How would you respond to that?
Well, the Russians control territory that constitutes 90% of gross national product in Ukraine. They now control all the key resources, coal, iron, even agriculturally, they've got some great territory, but most of it is manufacturing. What Ukraine has for a scientific industrial base, anything that is worth holding on to, the Russians have already got. They can take the rest of it when the ground dries out if that's what they decide to do. And the area they're sitting on top of is traditionally Russian. The population there isn't Russian. In fact, the Ukrainians have complained bitterly in Bakhmut about the fact that the Russian people there continually informing the Russians as to their location. And one of the reasons the battles in the Donbass have taken so long to fight is that the Russians have declined to use their conventional weapons of mass destruction, the thermobaric warheads on their heavy rocket artillery. If they did that, the battles would be over within a day or two. But they've got thousands of Russian citizens, Russian speakers, who live in Ukraine in those areas, and they're not willing to kill them. So the Ukrainians have naturally tried to get close to the Russian speakers. That hasn't worked out very well for them because they tell the Russians where they are. The Russians come in. It's long and arduous, but eventually they kill them and drive them out.
You don't hear that on the Western media. That is for certain.
Well, you got to remember, Charlie, Putin is evil. Anything he does is evil. Russians are bad. It's all nonsense. And when we finally get to the truth, we're going to find out that the only serious war crimes committed in this war were committed by Ukrainians against Russians and against the civil population. I mean, the situation in Ukraine is really desperate. I mean, you're now dragging in boys and women to fill the slots that young men formerly filled. He's got very few reserves left of able-bodied men. His generals keep telling him to pull out of this, but he keeps feeding the meat grinder. And if you're willing to come and impale yourself on the Russian defenses, there's not much incentive for the Russians to move. Why not wipe out the Ukrainian army, what's left of it, by the time the spring rolls around, there'll be almost nothing left. And I think that's where we are. Now you're talking about blackouts everywhere all over Ukraine. The whole energy sector is being destroyed. There's almost no air defense left, which means the Russians can use whatever they want, aircraft, missiles, at will.